Good morning. I come to you not as a part of the CUCC family, but as grief counselor for Save a Hospice. Julie and I have talked a lot about grief recently and a lot about grief care recently. And I think given the week that we are moving into from the Christian faith perspective, it is pretty amazing that the science of grief care and recovery is so well connected to the historical facts that happened during this particular period of time where Jesus was celebrated, Jesus was crucified, and Jesus was resurrected. In much the same way as when we embrace our grief and care for it, we go through a very similar process. We feel like we are living life, we have our life destroyed, and then we come out of the other side with life that is a more authentic and purpose-filled situation than we ever could have imagined before. So keep that in mind. I also want to talk very quickly about a situation that happened to me when I entered into my residency program for clinical pastoral education, CPE, back in 2018 and 2019. Our spiritual care supervisor, her name was Kimberly, without knowing any of us that were coming in to learn the art of chaplaincy, the art of deep listening, the art of being present, the art of compassion and using curiosity as a method of connecting to folks that were going through very serious illnesses and very serious traumatic experiences and crises in their life. She gave all of us a little plaque with an inspirational quote that she thought might be good for us to refer back to. And the quote she gave me was from a man named Howard Thurman. And if you've never studied Howard Thurman, let me just encourage you to go and research him. He's one of the most important figures, especially in the area of bringing diverse people groups together, in the area of raising our consciousness beyond the dualistic way that so much of our society is based on, and certainly from a spiritual awareness standpoint, just an incredibly massive figure, was a huge part of the connection to Dr. Martin Luther King and Dr. King's process throughout his time as the leader of the civil rights movement. But so I had never heard of Howard Thurman before I got this quote from Kimberly, but she gave it to me, and I thought it was one of the most fascinating things that I'd ever heard, and it says this. Howard Thurman said, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because the world needs people who are doing what makes them come alive." And what I found out is that looking at grief care literally brings new life if we will embrace the process. And so today we're going to talk about what grief is. We're going to talk about what the process of embracing grief care is. And we're going to talk about what happens if we will embrace that process. And the first thing that I want to point out to you is this picture of Mount St. Helens. Oh, that's weird, looking at myself on the screen. I don't think I've ever done that before. This picture of Mount St. Helens. If you are of a certain age and you hear the word Mount St. Helens, there's things that are triggered in your mind, memories that we have. If you are not of a certain age, then I'll give you a little bit of history. Mount St. Helens is a volcano. It is in Vancouver, Washington, in the Cascade Forest, and has historically been a place where folks go, and especially pre-1980, where folks go to retreat, to find spiritual renewal, to connect with nature, to do all those amazing things that happen when you separate and just become restored. However, it is a volcano, and in March of 1980, seismologists, not yet, March, but thank you. Appreciate your presence. Who knew I was going to find a heckler at church? In March of 1980, seismologists started seeing that things were going on that were going to create an eruption. And so through March and April of 1980, the signs of an eruption being imminent were all there. So they knew that eruption was going to happen. What they didn't realize in May of 1980, how disastrous that eruption was going to be. You can go ahead and show that next picture. In May of 1980, this is what occurred. This is from a time-lapse camera, right as the eruption of Mount St. Helens was happening. It literally blew off the top 1,500 feet of the mountain. But more than that, it created an eruption that was so vast that it covered 230 square miles. And within that 230-mile radius, if you were standing there, you were met with a blast force of 300 miles an hour, and you were met with air that was heated to 600 degrees. And so anything in the path of that blast was absolutely obliterated. It was complete and utter devastation. A place that meant so much to so many people was gone and flattened. And so what I've experienced as a grief counselor over the last few years is that is exactly the kind of devastation that many of us go through when we experience grief in our life. And so I want to give a definition of grief. Grief is the process of facing loss due to death or change in life circumstances. This process typically includes, but is not limited to, great sadness and despair. Now, this is my definition based on a lot of research and a lot of just experience talking to people in grief groups. We have 3 grief groups that we're a part of that we lead every month, one of which is here, and then one of which is in Visalia, and one of which is in Porterville, but then also in grief counseling. So this idea of total and utter devastation is something that is experienced by everyone just about that we talk to. The difference is that a very few of those want to move into the process of embracing their grief, because grief is the scariest thing that many of us will ever experience as a human being. There is suffering in this world, and unfortunately there's nothing that we can do about that suffering. But I believe that this suffering has a purpose. And we're going to look at a few of those things. Grief, first of all, if we'll embrace it, opens us up to emotions that allow us to feel more alive, to Howard Thurman's point. Grief opens us up to empathy. And with empathy, when it's shared with others, allows for a greater depth of relationship and sense of community. And as we said, grief is the starting point for what can be a new season in our life. A new season of awareness, a new season of purpose, and a new season of motivation to live life as, to quote Jesus in John chapter 10, live life to the full. So a lot of us have heard of the stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is somebody that is well known in a lot of areas. And she was the first person back in the late 1960s and 70s and up through the 90s when she passed, who was considered the first real expert on grief. And she identified 5 stages of grief. And I want to give a real clear parameter around these 5 stages. These are not sequential things that happen. So when you experience a loss, you are not going to be able to sit there and think, well, first we're going to have depression, then we're going to have anger, and then after anger, I'm almost done. I'll deny that this thing happened, and then I'll accept it, and then it'll be over. That's not how it works. These are more 5 realities of grief, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is on record as to say that she wishes that she had not called them stages, because that indicates sequence, and these are not sequential. You can feel and experience all 5 of these stages within an hour. You can go 2 years and only feel 1 or 2 of these things. But certainly these are things that can happen and usually do happen in grief. And the reason that grief is such a difficult thing to tackle is you may, 3 months after your loss, get to a season of acceptance. Okay, I'm starting to feel normal. And then 3 days later, have an absolute black hole of a day where you're depressed and you're triggered and you don't know what's going on, but you're asking yourself, well, 3 days ago I accepted it. Why is it doing this now? And it's so important to know, A, that's totally normal. Because so many people are like, oh, what's wrong with me? Nothing's wrong. It's what grief does. And B, as we're going to talk in a few minutes, it's so important to have people to go through that process with. And then there's a 6th stage that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's protege, Dr. David Kessler, discovered in his work. And Dr. Kessler worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross before she died and took her work and carried it forward. And he started to realize that as people work through their grief, embrace their grief, and go through some of the things that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, they start to find meaning. They start to come alive. They start to experience resurrection, if you will, of their soul, of their vision, of their perspective. And so now it is accepted that there are actually 6 stages of grief. And I can tell you that this is something that I see on a weekly basis. And here's what it looks like to find meaning, if you will. Because sometimes this finding meaning, this new revelation, happens in increments. So we were in grief group the other night, and one of our grief group participants said that they were going to attempt to fix their washing machine in the coming week. Every time we meet for a group, which is every 2 weeks, we always find something that we can move forward. We find something we can celebrate. We find something that has been very difficult. And then we find something that we can move forward in. And this person said, I'm going to try and fix my washing machine for the first time ever. And I was like, really? Wow. How do you find that out? She said, YouTube. And so I said, okay. And so we were all really excited that this person was going to do this. And so we celebrated that with her. Then 2 days later, she sent me pictures. She said, I did it, exclamation point. I fixed the washing machine. And I was like, no way. And she showed me pictures, like this whole document of things that she had done. And I said, can I share this with the group? We've got a group email. Can I let them know that this worked? And she said, absolutely. So I did, and everybody's just all excited. The reason that's important is because she would have never tried to fix her own washing machine had her husband still been alive. He would have done it. So without that loss, she never would have done that. And that feels like this weird dichotomy of like, how in the world is grief a good thing? It's not. But it does produce life and celebration that otherwise would not have been possible. And it's strange and it's mysterious, but it works. And we see stories like that all the time. Sometimes it's that somebody doesn't feel shame for crying. And crying is such an important part of grieving and such an important part of the human experience. It's actually healthy for us to cry. But so many people are ashamed of it. And this person said, for the first time since my loved one died 4 months ago, I can cry and not feel shame over it. And we celebrate it because that's good, because that's a part of the finding meaning process. So engaging grief, the only way out of it, the only way out of the pain is to go through the pain. The grief never ends. But that deep pain, and I think I may have, oh, I did. I forgot the markers of grief. The deep pain that we feel, and, okay, we're back there. Sorry, Rod. That we feel Well, let's just look at this and kind of maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. First, there are markers. There's not stages that are sequential, but there are markers to kind of to kind of know, to get your bearings, so to speak. And the first marker is anticipatory grief. Before there is a loss that occurs, you see it happening, you know it's going to happen, and there's anticipatory grief that is something that allows you to basically prepare yourself for the blast, if you will. And then there's acute grief, and this is the thing that scares so many people, because acute grief, the sensation of acute grief is free fall. It's this absolute directionless, it's like you're in outer space, floating, falling, with no way to tether yourself. And it's not just the feelings of sadness, it's just absolutely terrifying because you feel isolated and that there's no end to it. And this can last for a while. And I want to also let you know that early grief, what people would consider early grief, a lot of times the definition for folks that have never embraced it is like, well, I should be over this in a couple of months. Early grief, scientifically speaking, is normally experienced over the course of 2 years. But if it lasts 3, 4, 5, or longer years, that's totally normal as well. There's no blueprint for getting through grief. But eventually, your acute grief, you'll finally feel like at some point you can at least stand on the ground and you're not free falling anymore. And that's what we would call early grief. And that could be after a 2-year process. And again, if you're trying to negotiate through acute grief by yourself, it's almost impossible. And it has some health risks to it that we'll get into in just a second. So early grief doesn't mean that the grief has gone away or that you're not feeling the sadness, but it does mean that you can function in what would be considered a routine. And then finally, mature grief is when you can move from just feeling sad about the loss of your loved one to having some love replace some of that sadness. And so what that looks like, my grandmother died, I called her Granny, when I was 28 years old. She was my step-grandmother, and I was adopted, so we had no biological connection between us whatsoever. She didn't have any biological kids of her own, and I was her only grandson. She used to say, she would introduce me as her favorite grandson, and I would say, I'm your only one, you don't really have a choice. But she was such a monumental figure in my life growing up. And I knew it then, I know it even more now. I have a picture of her on my desk at my house. And I talk to her all the time. And I still miss her. I mean, even talking about her now, I just miss her. I feel the pain and the sadness that she's not here. But she also inspires me. And she also is a source of so much love and inspiration for me in how I connect with other folks in the world. And so that's kind of what mature grief looks like. But to give you an idea, that was 25 years ago that I lost her. And so, and still daily, she is a part of my life. Engaging grief, again, we go through it. The only way out of the pain is through it. First of all, don't run from it. Someone said on a podcast, allow the pain up on your front porch, kind of to have a glass of tea with it. And again, it's so scary to do that. But our society is grief illiterate. We shame grief, we dismiss grief, we try to stay strong. And we talked about this in grief group about a month ago. What does it actually mean to stay strong, and who are we staying strong for? And nobody could really figure that out. All that really staying strong meant to people were that we don't show anybody our grief. We want people not to see us struggling. But then all that does is teach them that they shouldn't struggle either. And so all of us are trying to show each other how strong we are, and then when we're alone, we fall apart. And then we feel shame because we still feel this deep despair that we think we ought to be getting over. But we can't get over it because we're not engaging. So it's this vicious cycle that continues. Thich Nhat Hanh, one of my absolute favorite spiritual leaders, Vietnamese Buddhist leader who just passed recently, said, if you learn how to suffer, you suffer less. And that is what we are trying to do, is as we, the grief staff at CUCC Hospice, learn how to suffer, teach other people how to suffer less, provide resources to help them suffer less. And Reverend T.D. Jakes, out of Dallas, Texas, said that not crying doesn't make you stronger. Not crying makes you sick. And he's absolutely right. There's so much evidence that show that if we hold our grief in, it causes inflammation. Inflammation causes so many different types of diseases, illnesses that we suffer from. And so grief recovery, this process of embracing grief, is actually healthy for us. So how do you get through grief most effectively? Once you've identified it, once you understand what's going on, what do you do? Well, first of all, the most important thing is you have to let your grief be witnessed. And this is the case with any trauma. If you're going to recover from any trauma, that trauma has to be witnessed. The problem is, and the irony of it is that someone is the cause of your trauma. And so once that happens, everyone becomes a threat. So we want to isolate. And grief is the same way. We don't want to make connections with other people because we're going to lose them eventually. And yet, scientifically speaking, and this isn't my data, this is data that, you can Google all of this. But our grief has to be witnessed. It's why I love grief groups so much. People ask me all the time, how do you do that? How do you go and sit with people who are just crying? I said, you don't get it. People are figuring it out, and they are discovering new ways of living and new points of inspiration. And I get to be a part of that. It is the most sacred, holy ground that I've ever been on as a human being. And I walk out of there. This past Wednesday, we had such an amazing group. And I was just flying high. This was our Visalia group, so I had a 45-minute drive home. And I was just so amazed. And I literally at one point just got down, after everybody had left and I was cleaning the room up, I just got down on a knee because I was so amazed that I got to be a part of that. I just thanked God for letting me be there. And all I didn't really do anything. I just gave people permission to be real and be honest and be seen. And it was so, so amazing. So let your grief be seen. And what I mean by that is give me a call. Christy and I, and this is my coworker, my supervisor, Christy Thompson, and she's an amazing, amazing community resource in all of the Valley. She works in Fresno County, Kings County, Madera County. You may be spread out over into Nevada and Arizona at this point. That was a joke. Thank you. But just an incredible resource, and she has such a passion for the entirety of hospice care. She's going to be in Hayden Hall after we're done in here today, and so she wants to be a resource for anybody and everybody. So, and we've got some awesome food. Marge did an incredible job of making some baked ziti and some cheesy garlic bread, so a lot of cool stuff happening after we're done in here. But allow your grief to be witnessed. Find a group, find a friend, and find empathy. Give your vulnerability a place of safety. When we're in grief groups, we avoid starting sentences with the term "at least." We avoid starting sentences with the term "it could have been worse," because it could not have been worse. And we really encourage people not to compare their grief to other people's, but just be witness to other people's grief and be available for other people to witness their grief. And we certainly will never say, well, you should be over it by now. You shouldn't be. We have people that have been in our groups for 2 years. We literally, they were the first participants in our grief groups when we started these things, and we've been doing this for 2 years, and they've been in since day one, and they're still working through it. Find a friend that will listen to you, and this is so important, because grief, we try to fix people. If somebody, especially a family member, is grieving, we want to fix them. Oh, I'm really sad. Well, let me tell you what to do so you won't be sad. And that just makes it worse, because automatically, all that happens is they feel bad for grieving, and then they feel like they've grieved you, and they've somehow inconvenienced you into making them. So don't try and fix anybody. Just be present. Find somebody that will be present with you. Find somebody that will acknowledge what you're going through and just sit and listen. It's okay if someone says, I don't know what to say, but I am here for you, and I am with you, and your feelings matter and are safe in this space. Feel them how you will. That will create hope, and that will create a piece of your healing process. Educate your family members. Man, oh man, educate your family members. And if you need our help to do that, let us help you. Because again, family members, I'm just going to be blunt because you are my people, and I hope I am your people too, and I probably wouldn't do this in another. But family members can be the worst when it comes to grieving. Because again, they want you not to feel what you're feeling. So we do a little bit of education on how family members who may not have been directly connected to the loss that you're experiencing can help you in your process so that they are not making it worse for you. So other vital practices, individual self-care, and again, it can't all, and the science behind this says that it can't all just be self-care, but certainly there are moments where you're going to be by yourself. And so doing things like educating yourself on grief, YouTube, podcasts, websites, and we're going to give you a little bit of resource list here at the end in just a few minutes. Educate yourself on grief. It helps you not feel isolated, and there's so many good resources. There's a lot of resources online that are not good, but there's a lot of good resources on grief. Some just from people that are grieving, and some from professionals. But again, YouTube, podcasts, websites. Also, continue with your spiritual practices. Breath work. I was talking to somebody in our group in Porterville this week who had always looked at breath work as kind of woo-woo, like, oh, you're just going to breathe. What good's that going to do? Blah, blah, blah. And breath work, sitting and breathing deeply, gives your body the ability to be still. And that brings an incredible amount of healing. And she said to me, I'm sorry that I discounted this because I've been doing it and it's awesome. And I said, you're right, it is. And I'm so happy for you and proud for you that you found that. So breath work and walking, literally just walking, is so healthy for your spirit. And so if you can find the energy to do either one of those two things, that will be a huge help in your grieving process. Don't try to escape grief. It's not going anywhere. I'm not saying that drinking and getting high and binge watching and working out or gambling or eating are bad. I mean, they kind of are, I guess. But when you're doing those things to try and escape your grief, again, it just becomes a source of deferred inflammation, if you will, and really is not healthy. And then celebrate every step forward. And that can be, if you haven't brushed your teeth in a week because of your grief and you brush your teeth, celebrate it. If you decide you want to fix your washing machine, celebrate it and tell somebody about it. Let them celebrate it with you. We had someone who mowed their grass for the first time in their life. Their spouse had passed. Their spouse always mowed the grass, and the grass was getting too high, and they knew they had to mow the grass, and the mower was too heavy for them to push, and another family member gave them a little electric mower that they could push, and they mowed the grass, and they shared it with us at Grief Group, and they said, the grass was beautiful. I had no idea I could do that. And again, we celebrated, like, yes, good for you, good for embracing this process. So we cry with that person, and we celebrate with that person. There's a lot of that going on. It might feel a little bipolar, I guess, I don't know, but And again, inform your family members of how they can best support you through your grieving process so that they witness you, they don't try to fix you. And then finally, why this works. And I'm using these as anecdotal, but there's good science behind this. In front of you, you have a picture of a lotus flower. And a lotus flower, for our Buddhist friends, is a very important symbol. And in my CPE experience, I was encouraged to study a spiritual practice that was different than anything that I had ever been a part of, and I'd never been Buddhist. So I studied the Buddhists and found so many complementary things about that practice that worked with my own history and practice. But the lotus flower is an amazing symbol because, first of all, it's beautiful and its beauty is celebrated, but also what it grows in is celebrated. And what a lotus flower grows in is mud that is particularly gross. I don't know the components of it, but it is a mud that is sludge, essentially. And it stinks, and it's full of dead things. But the lotus flower can't grow without that particular kind of mud. And so it's not just the flower that they're celebrating, they're also celebrating what it's growing out of because it's necessary. And that's how suffering works with us. A more American way of looking at it is that good soil smells bad. My wife, Kat, and I were in Home Depot. We're trying to make something out of our backyard, which is up to this point just been a mess. So we're in the department, the outdoor department of Home Depot the other day, and we buy a bag of soil, and it's gross, and we don't want it to get on us, and we're trying to hold it out away from us, but at the same, we're trying to coordinate holding it together. She's on that side, I'm on this side, but we don't want to get it on us because then we're going to smell like the poo that's in the bag. Again, I probably wouldn't say that to anybody else but you guys, but that's what it is. It's a bag of poo, and it stinks. But if we want pretty flowers, that has got to be what we use. Grief is the bag of poo. The process that we just talked about of having your grief witnessed, of being a part of a group, of having a trusted friend is the water. And you're the seed. And as you go through that process, and as you allow that fertilizer, that mud, to get on you and become a part of who you are, you will grow. It's not just spiritual, it's science. The data is there. And finally, I want to end on this picture. That is Mount St. Helens today. And it has gone through this exact same process that we have talked about. 5 years after the eruption, scientists started noticing that the salmon population, who along with every other population had been obliterated, the salmon population, even though there was still no growth and there was still so many signs of devastation, the salmon population started recovering, and then even the numbers of salmon even increased from where they were pre-blast. So even 5 years after the eruption, the recovery process started. And now, it's not the same. It used to be a 10,000-foot peak in elevation. Now it's an 8,500-foot peak in elevation. And you can see where the top of it was blown off, literally. And it doesn't look the same, but the beauty has returned and the inspiration has returned. And it's the same process that we go through. And I want to invite you all, again, to come over to Hayden Hall after we're done here to talk more about this. Call me. I'll have my business cards. A lot of you have my personal cell phone, whatever. Text me on that. Text me on my work cell. I'll have business cards over there. And if anybody's interested in a group, let's start one, for sure. These are some resources. You can take a picture of that slide if you want to. First of all, that's my work cell phone, 559-563-2466. There is no charge to hospice grief care. Any hospice. It's a part of hospice care that is covered by Medicare. There's no charge to it. So people ask me, well, how do I pay for this? You don't. You don't have to. I don't make money off of you. I get paid from the company. So give me a call. Whatsyourgrief.com. We use that site all the time. It's got some amazing information, some amazing articles by folks that are both professionals in the industry, but also people that have just experienced death. The Burnout Book, don't want to get too heavy into that, but theburnoutbook.net, go to that website. You will be glad that you did. And then again, YouTube, you could type in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, David Kessler, Francis Weller, type in grief support. So many cool videos. Some aren't, but find the thing that works for you. There's no prescribed way to get through grief, except that you connect with your heart and you validate yourself, because before anybody else can validate you, you have to validate it yourself. So do yourself a favor and go check out some of those resources. And then finally, podcasts. There's a ton of podcasts on grief support. So check all those out. Come hang out with us after church. Thank you, Julia, for letting me get up here. And yeah, come talk to us about this, because we know it's a big deal and most of us are dealing with this in some way or another. Love you guys. Appreciate it.